This is Group 3's presentation on Aboriginal health and self-governance. During this presentation, we will discuss the purpose of the presentation, the current state of Aboriginal affairs, what is self-governance, where we will touch on the history of self-governance of Aboriginal peoples, the current state of self-governance of Aboriginal peoples, the health state of Aboriginal peoples, and the issues with self-governance of Aboriginal populations. We will also discuss the cultural resurgence of Aboriginal peoples and community development, as well as population health approach utilization to address inequality, the significance of transferring health care services to Aboriginal communities, the role of registered nurses in empowering Aboriginal communities, issues for registered nurses working in Aboriginal communities, and then we will go to a debate and a conclusion.
The purpose of the presentation is to view the issue of self-governance in First Nation communities all over Canada, to relate self-governance to some of the health inequalities and injustices that First Nations people face, and to share opposing opinions on the importance of self-governance in First Nation communities, followed by a conclusion.
This video will highlight the current health issues within First Nations reserves.
There are needless deaths and suffering caused by profoundly poor determinants of health. The people have experienced poor health outcomes and substandard state of health and well-being as a result of inadequate medical diagnosis and treatment of preventable diseases. The urgency of the critical situation requires an immediate, stronger response and acceptable commitment. The Anishinaabe healthcare system must be transformed to prevent further harm or damage to the safety, health, and well-being of First Nations peoples.
When we see 10-year-old kids taking their own lives, and I was in Bearskin Lake just before Christmas when that young girl took her own life, there is something wrong. There is something horribly wrong with the healthcare system, and we need to bring that to the attention of the public, of the provincial government, of the federal government, that they need to work with us, that we can no longer just sit idly by and accepting the status quo, that something needs to change, and that's why we're doing this today.
What is self-governance? From a First Nations perspective, it is a determination of priorities, practices, and institutions of governance by distinct political communities. Simply put, it is a community's ability to govern itself through the administration of community resources. What does self-governance give First Nations communities? It gives First Nations communities the ability to contribute to and participate in the decisions that affect their lives and carry out effective relationships with other governments. It provides more control over social, economic, and educational development. In 2003, the West Bank First Nation communities signed a historic self-government agreement, giving them the tools to make decisions over land, resources, culture, and infrastructure. This video looks at how they are doing since.
In the heart of British Columbia's Okanagan Valley, across from Kelowna, is West Bank First Nation. In 2003, the Okanagan peoples of West Bank reaffirmed their dream of becoming a true nation with the signing of their self-government agreement. Now, everywhere, the signs reflect the reality that West Bank is a First Nations government. The band has the right to govern its own affairs and the responsibility to make decisions affecting the well-being of the community while being held accountable to its electorate. More than 20 laws are already on the books, covering such things as matrimonial and property rights, language and culture, resource management and the environment, land management, and taxation. That's vitally important to the 600-plus band members and to the more than 8,000 non-Aboriginal persons with residential leases on West Bank lands. The First Nations government has set up a non-Aboriginal advisory council to make sure everyone living on West Bank lands has a say in the community and is treated fairly and respectfully.
There's development costs.
The result is a friendly relationship between band and non-band members who believe the First Nations government is following a very progressive approach to lawmaking. West Bank's laws and taxation base support much of the progress and prosperity the community enjoys. A modern water treatment utility ensures safe, clean water for West Bank residents, paid for by the community's tax dollars and utilities fees. It's a system capable of handling the community's growth for more than a generation. Residential construction is booming in this community. Beautiful modern homes continue to dot the landscape. Big box stores are being added to the more than 100 businesses already thriving in West Bank's bustling economy. Many have come about through direct partnership arrangements between West Bank's First Nations government and the private sector. This direct, on-the-ground relationship, without the need for lengthy approval processes, makes for more efficient and cost-effective results. And that's a major benefit to both partners. But there's more to West Bank than business. It observes its traditions as Okanagan peoples. Nowhere is this more evident than in the respect shown to its elders, the generation that made the West Bank of today possible. And the children, the generation who will create the West Bank of tomorrow. Census Houston, the place where you come to become anything you want to be. No better description for a school, nor for West Bank First Nation, where you can see the future today.
The history of self-governance of the Aboriginal populations. Before contact, First Nations were split into sovereign nations with unique cultures, government, economies, and laws. Lands were divided up by the people and resources were shared. First Nations feel they have an inherent right to self-governance. This feeling comes from the sovereignty they exercised prior to contact with Europeans. After colonization, many treaties were signed. From 1725 to 1867, pre-Confederation treaties were signed that outlined fishing, hunting, as well as land ownership rights and living arrangements between Europeans and First Nations. 1763 saw the Royal Proclamation being signed. Land rights of First Nations people were protected from private sale and settlement. 1880 to 1996, residential schools were in effect with mandatory participation to assimilate First Nations children into European culture. 1960s saw the 60s scoop. This was the removal of First Nations children from homes and placement into the child welfare system without family consent. 1867 saw the British North America Act. This act gave the Canadian federal government jurisdiction over Indian affairs. 1867 also saw the first Indian Act. This legislation gave the Canadian government the legal authority to replace Aboriginal forms of government with elected chiefs and councils. Despite the first Indian Act, many First Nations communities continued to exercise the inherent rights of self-government, sometimes covertly. 1969 saw the publishing of the White Paper. This paper proposed a major shift in Indian affairs by repealing the Indian Act, abolishing the Department of Indian Affairs, and general responsibility for First Nations affairs would be transferred to the provinces. 1982 saw the Constitution Act. This act affirmed the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal people of Canada. 1986 saw the Indian Health Transfer Policy. This policy proposed that the transfer of the administration of First Nations health services be transferred to First Nations communities. In 1995, the Inherent Right Policy was passed. This recognized the inherent right of First Nations to self-government as an Aboriginal right. 2015 saw self-governing acts. Canada has since signed 22 self-government agreements recognizing a wide range of Aboriginal jurisdictions that involve 36 Aboriginal communities across Canada.
Current state of self-governance for Aboriginal peoples are in collaboration with its negotiation partners. Canada has signed 22 self-government agreements recognizing a wide range of Aboriginal jurisdiction that involve 36 Aboriginal communities across Canada. Of those, 18 are part of a comprehensive land claim agreement. Despite Canada's constitutional commitment to Aboriginal self-government, scholars studying Aboriginal state relations agree that the implementation of self-government in Canada remains unfinished business. The health needs of Aboriginal communities continues to be determined by outside agencies, usually without Aboriginal input. Across Canada, Aboriginal-controlled organizations have emerged to fill service gaps and advocacy needs.
Overall, health status of Aboriginal peoples within Canada is significantly lower than non-Aboriginal peoples due to the effects of colonization. The residential school system has insulted the spirit of the First Nations people. It has had, and continues to have, destructive effects on many individuals, families, and communities. The impact of colonialism on Aboriginal peoples began with their dispossession of and displacement from traditional lands in the 20th century. The political agenda of the 20th century colonial system was to assimilate and acculturate Indigenous people into the dominant culture. This agenda is evident in legislation and social policies that reward assimilation through resources and opportunities, while punishing cultural retention through the creation of inequities. The most powerful mechanism of assimilation was the residential schools. Through these schools, culture, language, family ties, and community networks were destroyed. Residential schools led to a dramatic and devastating sociocultural effect on Aboriginal peoples. Those who have attended residential schools blame their negative impact of health and well-being on isolation from family, physical, emotional, and verbal abuse, harsh discipline, loss of cultural identity by separation from their community, witnessing abuse, and loss of language. The health of the Indigenous population continues to be affected adversely by injustices of a colonial history that yielded inequalities in the distributions of health determinants.
Issues with self-governance of Aboriginal populations. Self-governance has been applied to First Nations and some Métis and Inuits who remain connected with their traditional territories, but Aboriginals who do not have a specific affiliation remain undefined and not a part of the self-government. Policies can be too generalized and decrease the fundamental strength of the community-based programs they support. The concept of recognition has contributed to the struggle of communities who seek inclusion into political and legal communities from which they have been excluded from. Cultural resurgence of Aboriginal peoples and the community development. Instead of moving towards assimilation, there was a renewed interest and pride in Aboriginal peoples' cultural heritage and desire to restore their values. Historically, Aboriginal peoples comprised of several nations. They did not derive from power and authority, rather the way they connected with each other and their physical environments. The way Aboriginal peoples govern themselves is much different from those of other cultures and ethnicities. Aboriginal peoples have significant advances in their legal, political, and economic powers. Yet the changes have been too slow and peripheral. Aboriginal people continue to be uncertain citizens within their own country. As a result, there is an urgent need for a new social-political contract between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal segments of Canadian society.
First Nations cultural resurgence and the community development share similar roots and are closely intertwined. Cultural resurgence refers to recovering their identity, culture, and traditions that were lost from colonization. Colonization destroyed their identity related to their culture, communities, and land. According to Alfred and Corntassel, Indigenous communities can regenerate themselves to resist the effects of the contemporary colonial assault and renew politically and culturally. Aboriginal people requested the right to set their own cultural course, and they claimed that they must be involved in developing initiatives and policies with their own perceptions. First Nations people established their own organizations, and they started to go around their communities to develop plans to enhance their living conditions that are associated with their health and well-being. The reason is that government controlled all aspect of life of Aboriginal people with policies such as the Indian Act. The health of an individual and their family is substantially influenced by the community in which they live. First Nations governing their own affairs would provide a basis for developing community-specific health and healing systems. Aboriginal people know what their real problems are and how to resolve them better than others. Population health is an approach that aims to improve the health of the entire population and reduce health inequalities experienced by different populations. It is about creating the ideal conditions that supports the best possible health outcome for everyone, not just a particular group. Population health understanding. Health is determined as much by social, economic, environmental, and cultural factors as it is medical or genetic. This includes the social determinants of health and disease, health status, and how effective healthcare is in affecting the health of a community. Health inequalities can be reversed or prevented through well-constructed public policy, such as population health policy. Understanding the social determinants of health helps to identify and address inequities that Aboriginal peoples may face. Essential factors to health determined by First Nations include clean drinking water, safe and uncontaminated food, reliable sanitation, comfortable housing and workplaces, and adequate employment. Many Aboriginal people also face poverty as a result. It is important to note that self-determination is crucial in the health of First Nations people. They must be equal participants in political decision-making and have control over their lands, economies, education systems, and social and health services.
The significance of transferring healthcare services to Aboriginal communities. The Indian Health Transfer Policy of 1986 was established to increase community participation in all aspects of the health program, as well as encourage and support the transfer of control of health programs to bands, tribal councils, or other First Nations authorities prepared to accept such authority and responsibility. The transfer of healthcare services to Aboriginal communities provides them with more ownership over health resources and gives them the freedom to establish programs tailored towards their cultural and community needs. McIntyre MacDonald found that as of March 2008, 83% of eligible First Nations communities are involved in the First Nations control process and have taken on the administrative responsibility for healthcare services, either individually or collectively, through multi-community agencies or tribal associations. Through this policy, Aboriginal communities are better suited to expand, integrate, and create programs that improve the health of their members. The role of registered nurses in empowering Aboriginal peoples. Aboriginal health nursing is defined as the way in which nursing care is provided to Aboriginal clients and also the way in which nursing interventions are targeted towards Aboriginal communities and populations. Registered nurses play a key role in promoting the health of Aboriginal peoples. The Canadian Nursing Association has identified Aboriginal health and well-being as a focus area due to the diverse health inequalities faced by Aboriginal people in Canada. Nursing services are an integral part of a First Nations community's health and healing system. In some circumstances, nurses may be the first and only contact Aboriginal people have to healthcare services, especially on reserves. In order to empower Aboriginal people to become healthy, it is essential for nurses to keep in mind that addressing the health inequalities experienced by First Nations people goes beyond funding for more healthcare services. It also involves acknowledging the social determinants of health and other varying factors affecting their health. Nurses also need to be cognizant of how the First Nations communities they are working with defines health and healing. The importance of adopting a holistic care approach, as well as the significance of building relationships that foster trust between Aboriginal communities and healthcare providers. In all domains of nursing practice, nurses are held responsible and accountable for acquiring the skills and knowledge necessary to provide culturally competent care to their clients. The following video was created by the First Nations Health Authority to attract registered nurses to remote and isolated First Nations communities. The video shares important characteristics registered nurses should possess in order to effectively work with First Nations communities.
A lot of people get into nursing for the same ideals, that sense of wanting to help people and that sense of caring for each other.
Instead of moving away from illness, we're moving towards wellness, and that's really important.
FNHA works from a holistic perspective. We look at spiritual, physical, mental, emotional. We look at the whole wheel.
It's a different style of nursing. It's everything that nurses are brought up to be and embrace. A holistic approach, I believe in the model of FNHA in empowering people and capacity building.
I think that's important from a grassroots point of view, to build rather than to have the old top-down approach. And it empowers people to want to take charge of their healthcare.
The very first thing that caught my eye with joining the resource team with FNHA is the chance to advance my career. We are going to obtain a remote nursing certificate, which allows us to practice at a enhanced scope. It allows us to really enhance our nursing skills currently and try to just challenge ourselves and grow as a professional.
It's not just holding hands and doing medication. You can do surgery, you can do outpost nursing, you can do travel nursing. There's so many opportunities.
My name is Gary Housty. I am a registered nurse. I've worked in the healthcare field for about 14 years. I get to travel in my position and I get to go to communities and meet people.
You are caring for that whole generation, and I think it's a very unique opportunity because each First Nation has their uniqueness.
Going into a community, you get to learn about their values, their ambitions, what they want as a culture and as a community, and work towards that.
Working with FNHA, I am able to pull from my experience in working in mainstream healthcare, not to fit my agenda, but to fit the community.
It's nice to get out there and just mingle and be involved in their community events. I love the area. I love to fish. And I caught something and it started pulling and pulling. And I was telling everybody about it. And it wasn't until I spoke to one of the elders and he had said, "Silver slime?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "You hooked into a whale." So that's my story. I caught a whale.
There is just a tremendous opportunity to work with people, to care for people, and to truly make a difference in people's lives.
And I've had that where I've gone to see an elder thinking I'm gonna, just go in and see how she's doing and just spend some time with her. And I come away from there thinking, wow, I can't believe I just had this most amazing experience. And I don't know if I helped her. I hope I did, because she certainly touched my heart.
It acknowledges culture, it acknowledges respect, it acknowledges community, and those are really powerful elements that this organization is growing into.
I think there are many rewards to working with our First Nations communities. One of the first that would come to mind is to have the opportunity to really become part of their family and to be part of a rich culture and a history that every First Nation community in British Columbia has. I think there are a lot of rewards in that, and also just the idea of having the opportunity to be part of a journey where we've taken back our health and we are really changing the future.
Giving kind of ownership back to the people that we serve.
Every community is very welcoming. They'll look out for you while you're there to look out for them.
I think I've always been a nurse, always helping and always being a part of the family, and actually working in communities. I don't know another job that I'd love more.
If you want to make a change, if you want to see something different, if you want to do what you were trained to do in the truest, most purest way you possibly can, then you have to work here. It'll be an adventure.
Hello, my name is Marlene. I'm the Director of Nursing at the First Nations Health Authority. If you're a registered nurse who's interested in working in First Nations communities, some of the most beautiful landscape on the planet, please, we'd love to hear from you.
Issues for nurses working in Aboriginal communities. The nurse may not understand the Aboriginal people's culture and practice. They experience power inequities. There's frustration of nurses related to language and culture, which can lead to avoidance. They display a lack of respect, the low quality of practice environment, and an inability to create linkages. These issues create a disadvantage for the community when it comes to retention of the nurse.
Lack of attention to First Nations health practices and healing methods. Nurses are more focused on Western medical models rather than their cultural and traditional healing methods and practices. A lack of supportive work environment, shortage of nurses and other healthcare professionals, and the transfer of health services to First Nations communities is premature because of chronic underfunding and understaffing. There's also a lack of modern equipment. An example of this would be diagnostic testing machines. Delayed access to emergency care in isolated areas. This is often due to weather and distance. Low retention rates for nurses. This is due to isolation, lack of modern amenities, and leisure places. Also, nurses who work in isolated regions do not have much social life or support systems for themselves. Therefore, nurses typically do not stay long.
So today we're having an election on First Nation self-governance, and we have Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton here to provide their opinions.
I personally am for self-governance, and I will email everyone about it later.
Okay, Hillary, that's enough. You've been talking for like 5 minutes. It's my turn. I am also for self-governance. I honestly think we should build a wall. We're going to build walls around the reserves. We don't want them bettering themselves. They've been stealing all of our jobs. Let's make America great again.
Topic is on self-governance and why it should be a must for First Nations communities. The affirmative side.
First of all, increasing self-governance will not increase costs. It will just require a shift from one allocation of funds to the other government. Without self-governance, Indigenous people have a dependence on institutions and government structures that were not designed for their separate nations and do not reflect their ideas and values. Self-governance has been successful in creating jobs, revenue, and tourism. Self-governance gives the communities opportunities to flourish and gives the people their own choices as well as community-level decision-making, which will improve program responsiveness. This can empower and motivate people to solve their own problems and will promote overall happiness and strengthen democracy. It gives the community opportunities to benefit economically. Positive effects will spread the community and in turn benefit the health of the individuals. Education and health are strongly correlated. In a 2010 study that was done on First Nations people, self-governance allowed different allocation and resources for funding education needs. Appropriate measures can be taken to combat the problems of inequality in education levels, and education is one of the most effective ways to empower a community.
And now the opposing side.
It's unrealistic that self-governance would significantly impact education in a positive manner. The problem is that many persons in the community are already uneducated, so they're unable to educate others. To your point about colonization, the damage has already been done after colonization, and no amount of self-governance can entirely remedy this. Residential schools were a severe mistake made by Europeans. Self-governance will also be a decision made by Europeans and could be equally as damaging if First Nations communities are not prepared for it. While self-governance may be a right, it is our responsibility to take care of all Canadians. Due to the potential for corruption, ineffective leadership, and dependence of many reserves on government resources, self-governance may not be in their best interest at this time. Their leadership skills were also suppressed with colonization. This results in a lack of community leaders ready to take charge. They're also unable to manage themselves and their resources effectively. There's a potential for corruption within these communities. Indian Northern Affairs of Canada is in charge of distributing funds and monitoring resources for First Nations communities and spends approximately $1.2 billion per year on operations and $200 million for facilities for education on reserves. It is currently unknown at this time whether the funds given are actually being put toward education as intended. The question has to be asked, where are these funds going? This also contributes to negative stereotypes. Many communities are not currently self-sustaining and do not have the resources in place to become self-sustaining. They still require many resources from the Government of Canada. This is also not a true form of self-governance. They will still be under the federal jurisdiction of the Government of Canada.
Rebuttal.
Where you state self-governance cannot remedy colonization, I will argue that self-governance gives First Nations the opportunity to bring back their culture, language, and practices, despite the damaging effects it's had. First Nations people have suffered a great deal due to the impact of colonization and the impact it's had on the community as a whole. Not allowing self-governance continues to colonize First Nations communities. You cannot prove at this time without the trial and appropriate resources that self-governance will lead to corruption with the communities or ineffective leadership. And this is only an assumption. Government cannot be built on assumptions. Self-governance can allow communities to take control of their own needs and allow for them to be self-sustaining and contribute more to society. For example, West Bank showed they are able to be a self-sustaining community.
So now we're going to hear the closing statements. We're going to start with those for self-governance for First Nations communities.
It is affirmative that Indigenous communities must be given the right to self-government as a historical and legal right. It has the potential to help restore the impact of residential schools and colonization. It may enable communities to improve their economic standing and self-sustainability. It has shown that a higher level of education is crucial to empower communities and allow them to reach their full potential. Self-governance can allocate the funds to do this. Many Aboriginal people are burdened by social determinants of health. They occupy higher rates of homelessness in low-income households. This pertains to colonization, policies, and practice that negatively affect and have affected them throughout the years, contributing to health disparities. Members of Indigenous descent need to be given the opportunity to directly address their own health and spiritual needs without the influence of government because it lacks indigenization. Aboriginal people are the experts of their own health and determine their own healthcare needs.
And now for the opposing side.
Self-governance cannot be given until First Nations communities are prepared to receive it. Irreparable damage has already been done after colonization, and it is too late to go back. Instead, we must move forward and find methods other than self-governance that can repair this damage. This new form of self-governance would not be the same as the First Nations pre-contact self-governance. Federal jurisdiction would still be present, and many members of First Nations communities would still need to leave reserves for the services they require. Many First Nations communities have also struggled with leadership and corruption. Both of these factors will have to be remedied before self-governance can be given. Self-governance will also result in further segregation of an already segregated population. This will fragment the country of Canada and could strain relations even further. In conclusion, colonialism created conditions of inequality and inequity among Aboriginal nations and their societal structures. This is a complex, ongoing issue for the culture. There are equally compelling arguments for and against self-governance and evidence to coincide with both sides. There have been Aboriginal communities that have obtained very successful self-governing systems and others that have failed substantially. Even when Aboriginals successfully establish self-governance, they still have the potential to acquire other concerns such as segregation, discrimination, and corruption. It is vital that the Aboriginal people within communities possess the education, leadership, and economic skills required to make self-governance a feasible option.